Right, hello. I've come to Silchester today, Roman Silchester to be exact, because there is a town of Silchester which is not Roman, or as the Romans would have called it, Cavella Antrabatum. It's a Roman settlement that unusually was completely abandoned. Most Roman settlements were refounded as modern towns, but this one completely disappeared off the map. And we're just going to go and have a look at and see some of the interesting things that they left behind. The Roman town of Silchester was built on about 40 hectares, and to give you some idea of what kind of scale that is, that entire field, well, thank you fingers, that entire field all the way along there, all the way to the tree line, all the way around there, and this entire field all the way to the tree line, all the way around here, that's the entire site of the Roman town. That's 40 hectares. So it was a pretty big place. It was a major centre of ancient Roman Britain, and yet all that remains of this great town is its castle walls. These walls date from the 3rd century. They replaced an earthen rampart that was built in the 2nd century. So for about 1,700 years these walls have stood. They're overgrown now and a little bit worn, but they do still exist. And this site here would have been the North Gate, one of the main entrances to the settlement. Over the top would have been a tower that would have let one cart pass through at a time. Just behind us here, this would have been a moat or ditch with a wooden bridge, and that would have been the only route into the town from the north. There were 4 gates, north, south, east and west. It's very much the traditional Roman plan. And as we come out, we can see the whole extent of the site, except that that hedge that runs along the middle, that hedge, that's the halfway point. There's another bit equally large on the other side. Here's another view of the gatehouse from the top. Even in their worn state, this would give you a very decent advantage over any attackers, though you might want to get rid of the ever-present blackberry bushes. So the original settlement here was a native British settlement for the Antrabates tribe, who ruled this area of the country, hence the Roman name Cavella Antrabatum, which just sort of means settlement of the Atrebates. The population here would have been, in the British time, entirely British, and this was a major manufacturing centre and trade centre in the period. There's elements of chariot making, horse training, skilled metalwork, all going on this site. And that's presumably how the Romans would have originally come into contact with the Antrabates. The native settlement occupied approximately half the size of the Roman one, but it suggested that it was a pre-planned settlement of a much less technologically capable level, but similar in Roman design, with the original settlement being made from people who came over from Gaul. So don't think sort of little mud huts, think very well planned grid layout of British roundhouses. And it was a real manufacturing centre. The Romans took the town over when they conquered it, conquered all of Britain, and it was one of the major towns of the south, along with other ones that are still fairly famous today, like Winchester, Chichester, Londinium. And it was a major stop on the road to Silchester, which was one of the largest cities in the country, and has often been postulated the capital of Britannia 1 or 2. That is to say, Britain was divided up into different provinces, Britannia 1, Britannia 2, and we're not sure exactly where the borders were. This style of building was seen for hundreds of years using the local flint off the chalk as the main resource. Flint, an incredibly hard stone, makes a very effective outer shield, and you can polish it very, very flat if you need to, make it very difficult for people to climb. Obviously this has weathered over the years. You can see a Roman mortar with aggregate in it linking up these blocks of flint. When well maintained, that would have been a very smooth, difficult target to climb. It's quite unusual for a Roman city of this size to have been completely abandoned. Most of the other settlements of that size were abandoned and then resettled. So, as I said before, Winchester, Chichester, Cirencester, they all went empty for sometimes 50, 100 years. But the people did return because they were very useful, helpful sites. Why they didn't return to this one, we're not sure of. The other interesting part of that is most of those big towns were abandoned in the 5th century. The Saxon raiders were hitting all the major towns. People fled to the countryside, a very natural response. But Silchester remained occupied until the 6th or maybe even 7th centuries, quite late into the Saxon period, and then everybody left. So it's quite an unusual site in that regard. Not sure particularly why. It does suit the Iron Age settlements more than medieval settlements. There isn't a great water resource nearby. It's not high up on the hill, although it is on a fairly high rise, as it were, amongst the valleys. It's not the most defensive site, so I can see why people wanted to go to other major towns. It's just unusual that they'd live here for as long as they did, and then disappear. The population of the settlement would mostly have been native Britons, even during the Roman period. There was a large forum, several temples to various Roman gods. The British were encouraged to link their native gods to the Roman gods, so they would have been quite happy worshipping in those Roman areas. There's also a theory that one of the temples was later converted into a church. There's relatively scant evidence. As you can see, there's nothing here. So that one might be only a possibility. There would have been a very large centre for hospitality, as there were lots of travellers moving through, lots of traders moving through, and there was a now I can't remember the Roman word for it, but a hospitality centre specifically for servants of the empire. So those travelling on imperial business would always be guaranteed a bed and food and lodgings near the gatehouse as they were travelling around the empire. And this would have been a very cosmopolitan area. It would have been on one of the major trade routes, would have been getting lots of foreign visitors, lots of travellers across the country. So imagine it as a modern equivalent of places like, well, not quite on the level of London, because even then London was bigger, but other big major centres like Manchester or Leeds, very big manufacturing and trading centre for a vast swathe of southern Britain. The name Silchester means Roman town in the woods, or wooded Roman town, and it's difficult to see these days because the entire area has been cleared for excavation works and now animal grazing. But there's forests all around here. You can see on every horizon there's a huge line of trees. So this probably would have been very wooded all the way since its abandonment until the Victorian period when it was cleared for excavation. There aren't many references to it after everybody left. It seemed to have mostly dropped out of history. Not many people even remembered it existed, but there are a few references to it, most notably in the Anarchy. That's Stephen and Matilda, you may remember mentions of it from when we were in Wallingford. There's a record that one of their knights fortified this site, believed to be this site. They called it a castle in the woods in this area, so it's presumably Silchester, and that's pretty much the only time it was mentioned until the Victorian period again. People just forgot that this area existed. There is a modern town of Silchester about 2 or 3 miles away, and there was a medieval town nearby that took the same name, Silchester, but as an area of interest in Rome, it never had it. People just forgot. And everything, unfortunately, rotted away or was taken apart for masonry stones. This is one of the only days of the year that can be called genuinely hot by English standards, and even the cows are desperately seeking shelter under the trees. It is a wonderfully hot day though, considering that we only get about a week like this every year. Right, I've come a little way away from the settlement there. There's the road on the other side of the tree line, and then the other side of the tree line is Silchester. And I've come this way because of this, the Roman amphitheater. This amphitheater would have been used for gladiatorial combat, public executions, wild beast fights, and a number of horse bones underneath the area suggest that also equestrian events, perhaps racing, perhaps a form of dressage. The site that you can currently see was built in the 3rd century and seated somewhere between 3,500 and 7,000 people, depending on different estimates about whether they were standing, seated, and how much further the site may have gone. And it's a very large space, as you can see. I'm actually quite surprised. I thought it would have been much smaller for one this size. This little refuge, there's a bit of a debate about. Some people suggest that it was for combatants to either sit in waiting to fight or to take refuge in after a bout, or if they had to retreat. Other people have suggested that this could be a shrine to the gods of some kind. There's no real evidence suggesting either one is correct. It's really quite an impressive site. To build it, they would have dug down this whole area and used the earth to build up the banks, and then in the 3rd century they put in the stone walls and better seating, all of which has, well, most of which has disappeared over time. Put out of your mind the idea that people fought to the death here. While it's possible that some died, the majority of gladiators were more like professional wrestlers. They would be showing off their skills, creating spectacles of fights, and they'd probably bleed, and there'd probably be some gore, and maybe someone takes a nasty fall and gets a very bad injury. But most of the time they were intended to entertain rather than to kill, especially in a place like this, far away from Rome, where you get huge numbers of rebelling slaves and Christians and conquered peoples who might be, the fodder for such deaths, because gladiators, an expensive resource. You didn't want to waste them, and by analysing their diets, it suggests they're very, very high in calories, so they probably had a bit of extra fat everywhere that they could reliably cut into in order to bleed impressively for the crowd without actually damaging themselves. Certainly the various mosaics that exist show well-muscled, but perhaps not Greek statue levels of toned bodies. So I'm just now thinking some of these oaks must be 100 years old at least, maybe 200. And yet they are the later additions to this area. Down in this pit there's also no real breeze, and this being one of the hottest days of the year, I am beginning to regret staying down here. Focus on the foxglove, there's a good camera. Just walking down the road now from the amphitheater. Medieval Silchester was also abandoned, as I guess Silchester is just a cursed site once the Romans left. And the only remnants of it is a church called St Mary's Church from the 12th century, which I'm hoping will be open. Right, and there we are, that's the church. You'll often find a yew tree in a churchyard. It's a sign of the immortal life, as yew trees live for thousands and thousands of years. a really fascinating mishmash of different architectural styles. In my ignorance, it looks like these are 17th, 18th century buttresses that have been put on. And it's unusual to put them on in brick, but presumably that was because it was falling over. And then this must be modern. This must be 20th century or 21st century even, because that stone is too well faced to be anything older. Yeah, what an idiosyncratic little church. Right, I'm not actually going to walk around the whole site, as having seen the amphitheater, we've seen most of the interesting stuff that remains. It's just more wall, but to give you a sense of scope, that's the town wall continuing all the way around there. That line of trees is the midway point. That's the path I'm going to walk up. So this Roman town used to be huge. You know, the size of modern towns, and it's a real shame that everything was left to fall to pieces and or quarried for stone, because it would be really nice to have seen some of its buildings. For preservation reasons, everything that's been excavated has been recovered, as underneath the ground is much safer for you know, the floor plans and walls of temples and so on. So this central road that I'm walking up now is a modern addition. It wasn't in the Roman settlement, and in fact goes through some of the Roman buildings, which is a shame. In terms of ongoing archaeology, this particular area of the site just in front of me, Reading University comes back every summer to excavate a new part of it. This area would have been housing, and they are trying to find out as much as they can about regular life in Roman Britain and how houses developed over time, and they have found all kinds of interesting artifacts, little silver horses, lots of ironwork and pottery, and really fascinating stuff that shows how people lived at the time. And it all comes from this area just in front of me, that you wouldn't think has been dug up at all recently. But since 1997, every single summer, Reading University has come out and dug it up.